back when I was doing the Investigates, I did do like an extensive death penalty
I remember
series.
that,
So
yeah. And you covered Timothy McVeigh, right?
I covered Timothy McVeigh and Donald Ray Wallace as well.
Welcome to Inside Look. I'm Jeff Lyons, joined again by our old friend and former investigative news reporter here, Stefanie Silvey. How you doing, Stephanie?
I'm good. How are you?
Your last appearance here on Inside Look brought a lot of questions, comments, kudos. People were glad to see you back.
That's nice.
And they wanted to hear a lot more of what you had to say, in particular on crime and some of the beats that you covered. And we have, of course, this week, Roy Lee Ward will be executed on Friday. He was denied clemency. The family made a very compelling argument last week, I suppose. And so it's going to go through. And I know that you, of course, covered the crime against Stacey Payne up in Dale, and then the trial, and followed it basically from beginning and now to end, even though you're not working in the business right now. I wanted you, to kind of recount and share that process, what went on, and how you covered it and how you felt and things like that. So kind of take us back to 2001.
Well, I was thinking about it today because my daughter is the same age now that Stacey Payne was when she passed away. And that case was really the worst of the worst. I mean, like, I don't want to really get into specifics about what all she went through because the family has had to relive this in the media for 21 years. And that is one of the really unfair things about the death penalty is that it takes so long. It's so drawn out. But, back in 2001, Stacey was in her own home where she should be safe. And, Roy Lee Ward came to the door and was pretending that he lost a puppy. Somehow he made his way inside the home, and her sister was upstairs at the time and woke up to her screaming. And the crime was unimaginable. The violence that he did against her, rape was involved. And then he washed up in the sink, he stayed there. Luckily, the sister upstairs called 911, and the town marshal was close by and showed up there. And this is a hero. I know he probably doesn't want to refer to himself that way, but Matt Keller could have easily waited for backup. He didn't. He went straight in. It found Roy Lee Ward there with the knife, and and apprehended him, and then shortly after found Stacey lying there. I think about the fact that had he not done that, she could have died there with Roy Lee Ward as her last memory, or she could have died there in the kitchen alone. But, he got her. She knew she was conscious. She knew that she was with someone safe. She knew that people were taking care of her. And I think that is like an immense, it would have to be an immense relief for the family, at least, to know that she knew she wasn't alone and she was being cared for.
And so unthinkable. I mean, Dale, little tiny town, pleasant and everything. Did Roy Lee Ward have some connection to the family, or was he known to them, or was he from Dale, or what was his story?
Roy Lee Ward was kind of like a drifter. He had an extensive history of escalation crimes. So public masturbation is, something that happens with a lot of people that turn to murder, turn to rape. Sadly, in Indiana, it is just a misdemeanor, which I think is totally offensive. It's basically saying that it's the same as, a frat boy that pees in a bush outside of a party. It's a misdemeanor. It's not considered, a serious crime. Now, if you do repeat yourself, then it can be deemed a felony after the fact. But I think that the law needs to take that far more seriously. He had done that a number of times. He had broken into people's homes and stolen underwear, things like that. The nature of his crimes were clearly showing a pattern and showing some escalation there.
So you came into this story at what point? Obviously, we would have learned of her death here in the news department. You were sent on the story, I assume, and then how did you? The way you tell it, it sounds pretty open and shut. I mean, if the sheriff or the law enforcement came and, as you described the scene, there was evidence there he was there and everything, then what possible defense could they have had? You know what I mean? Maybe that's two separate questions. Let's go back to how you got involved with the story, and how did you kind of uncover what happened?
I was involved in the story from the very beginning. I was here, from the very beginning. I think at first, always with me, what I want to try to do is focus more on the victim than the perpetrator, because I think so often it's all about the person who commits the crime, and you want the victim to be seen as more than a victim. You want people to know who she was. You want people to know that this was a 15-year-old girl who was an honor student, who was in band, who was a cheerleader, who was loved by her community. You know, she was a sweet girl. And that tends to get forgotten sometimes because there's so much focus on the crime and the perpetrator. You're exactly right. I mean, this was a very, very clear-cut case. It doesn't get much clearer. He was there. He had the weapon in his hand. You know, there was a witness. You know, the sister actually saw it from upstairs. So there's a number of things that happened. I think that the defense-wise, they were just trying to show that maybe he wasn't sane at the time, or that he had, problems of, being a sociopath, things like that, where he didn't have the feelings, he didn't have control over his issues.
I want to go back around, and maybe this is the wrong term to use, but humanizing the victim and highlighting the victim. So to do that, I assume you talked to the family at some point down the line, and what was that like for you then to go in there, and what were you hoping to come out with?
That's the absolute worst part of the job. I hated it. Every time I had to do it, I hated it. I would sometimes get physically sick knowing that I had to ask a family member to talk. I would always try to go about it the right way. I would never knock on someone's door and just be like, hey, will you talk? I would try to talk to a pastor or talk to a family friend, or say, hey, this is why I'm calling. Like, I want to show who this person was. I want to humanize her, but I would always be fine if, they said no. I did talk to her aunt pretty early on. I never did talk to the parents, and I never pushed for it. I can't imagine what they went through, and it just wasn't something that I felt was necessary. But, to go I think about them all the time, because they've had to relive this for 21 years.
This is a Payne family, yes.
Yeah, and Roy Lee Ward, he tries to, or he in his defense say that, he feels this remorse, and that he has autism, he's autistic, and that maybe that somehow played a role, and that he's so sorry. But he keeps appealing, he keeps suing, he keeps this going.
Right.
And I feel like if you had true remorse for what you did, he's not denying that he did it. If he had true remorse and felt truly sorry for the family, then, he would maybe put them out of their misery with this. But he continues to, push every avenue to try to stop it from happening.
So you've talked to the family. We've kind of gotten to know who Stacey Payne was. Now the trial comes up, and you have to cover that process. And I assume you were involved in the courtroom at some point along the way. So describe that. What is it like to cover a murder trial? You're sitting in there looking at the accused, on the stand, and they're looking at you. What goes through your mind?
It's kind of crazy, because I've covered so many trials and a lot of death penalty trials, and they're all so different depending on the county that you're in. They're also different in the amount of security that's involved. I remember, John Stevenson was a case that went on for quite some time, and their courtroom was so small that I was literally sitting next to John Stevenson. Like, he would be like, he would have candy and ask if we wanted, some of the candy. I mean, it was that intimate that we were all right there. And with Roy Lee Ward, I think the thing that I remember the most about that case was the fact that even, like, his defense was referring to, him being a psychopath, and that he having these tendencies. His family said he's too dangerous, he shouldn't be out, So there was really no arguments as to the fact that he did it. I think that they were just trying to say that maybe he wasn't sane, but you did have, the evidence that he washed up. He did immediately say, oh, I didn't do anything. He did try to argue his way out of it. There are things like that went into play. But it was overturned because it was done in Spencer County, and it was ruled that it should have been somewhere else, because he couldn't have gotten a fair trial in Spencer County. So he got a new trial. So he's really like the only person, I think, that I know to date in Indiana who has actually had 2 juries sentenced to death.
And what was the second county? Where did they
Clay
go?
County, I believe.
Okay, so
Yeah.
up by Brazil, up by Terre Haute. Far enough away, I guess, at that time that people would not, have media exposure. Is this the idea that somehow rather the jury would be contaminated because if they are in the Evansville market, see your reporting, see our coverage, the newspaper and so forth, that somehow that would taint their ability
They actually
to render
did show examples of our reports. I think I might have been thrown in there, because we did report on things like the fact that he had all these previous, convictions, these previous incidents of sexual deviancy. So that wouldn't have been, known in the trial. And so they were saying that there was so much, that everyone knew about it. And they did question, I think 85% of the jurors, even the ones that landed, knew about the case extensively.
Sure. I've always wondered, have you ever served on a jury?
They always reject me.
Oh, you'd be a great one.
I go up
you'd be
there
and
I have been called and I have been questioned, but back in the day I used to know so many people involved,
Right.
and no, they always kicked me.
Usually media throws you out. I've
They
been
kick
in
me
the
to the
jury
curb.
pool a few times, never got called up. I was kind of curious to do it.
I wanted to too.
Yeah, just to see the process. But sometimes in a trial they'll throw out evidence, and it's like my mom used to work for an attorney, and he would say, "Well, you can't unring a bell. I mean, they heard it, So how do you unhear
Right.
something?" So. It's interesting, though, that he, at least in your knowledge, was one of the few that ever got, heard by 2 different juries, and they came up with the same conclusion. So now we have a death penalty, and that would have been 20 years ago or 22 years ago, I suppose.
Yeah. In the second trial, he actually pled guilty.
Okay.
Like he went ahead and pled guilty, but they sentenced him to death. So I think maybe he was thinking, I plead guilty, they'll give me a break, life without parole or something, but that didn't happen.
Yeah.
It was the second jury to say death.
Now, you have been on death row to do various stories.
I
and
have.
You've had connections with that. So kind of describe that environment, that, what took you to death row in the first place?
I did an extensive report back in the day on the death penalty, just kind of looking at the fact. I think it came about because of Donald Ray Wallace. Donald Ray Wallace was like the longest person in Indiana history. He sat, I think, for 28 years on death row, and just kind of looking in depth at how it plays out, the flaws in the system, for instance, and this may have changed, but back in the day, a lot of it was dependent on where the murder took place, because a lot of these counties could go bankrupt by trying, a death penalty case. They just didn't have the funds available for it. And so, some of the decisions on whether they were going to seek the death penalty or not were determined on the location of where it happened. So things like that. Also, the fact that it takes so long because of the appeals process, and what can be done about that, even in cases where the person themselves may not necessarily be the ones. The lawyers will do it on their behalf, even if they don't want to, continue appealing. So
Sure.
there's a lot involved there. I talked to family members of victims that were against the death penalty, and I talked to family members of victims that were for the death penalty. I also talked to a lot of death row inmates. I wrote back and forth correspondence actually with Eric Wrinkles, who was an inmate. He wrote me multiple times, I think, trying to push for why he felt like the death penalty was unjust, and tried to convince me, and I told him I was going to be fair no matter what, but he was very curious as to how I felt about it. And
But
wrote
that's
me.
anathema. I mean, as a journalist, we can't.
Right.
We
You
don't
can't-
have an opinion.
You don't
at
really
least
get
not a
into
public
that,
one. Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And but he was very interested, and I think he felt like he knew and wanted to convince me of why it was unjust. And so he wrote to me for quite a while, and actually wanted me to witness his execution when it came around. I had left television by that point, so I didn't. But I think that was on the table for sure for me
Yeah.
to be there. I covered Timothy McVeigh's execution as well, federal.
Of course, the bombing of the Oklahoma Center Federal Building in '95, I think it was.
And
So-
Donald Ray Wallace, I covered his execution as well.
Yeah, and that was the Patrick Gilligan family, about 1980, I believe, 80 or 81 in Evansville. Awful, awful crime. Well, take us inside. So the first time you have to go into death row to interview somebody or whatever, just walk us in there. Where was it? And then just kind of give us a sense for the experience.
So they generally won't take you to death row itself.
You're not up in the cell block.
They won't bring you up in the place, but they will bring them to you, and it's very, very controlled. A lot of times there's a complete room partition between you and the perpetrator. I have interviewed some other murderers where it's just you and them in the room. But for the most part, when it's a death row inmate and it's someone that's already in the federal in the federal or in the state penitentiary, it's very controlled. That you're usually like they're in one room and you're in another.
When you talk to these, I assume mainly men, right? In almost every case.
But I have talked to women. I have interviewed women murderers as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
And do you get a sense right off the bat that they're either on the level or that they are so good at deception that you could never believe anything they say, or you obviously have a sense, for when somebody's putting you on and when they're not.
Yes.
So what?
I feel like I have a very good instinct on that, and I can actually be in a room with strangers and have a feeling. And I don't know if that's honed in from my years of doing this or not, but I'm usually dead on the money. I have been in the room with some killers who I thought, inherently maybe they weren't bad people, that they probably, if they were to be let go, that they wouldn't, commit a crime again. That they, got involved in passion or drugs or what have you led to the behavior that happened. And then I have been in the room with other people that the hair on the back of my neck stood up and I inherently felt like they were evil. Yeah. And, I'm not in the news anymore, so I can say Roy Lee Ward was one of those people. There was just a deadness in his eyes. I know that they're saying now that it's because he's autistic, but there's so much more involved in that case. If you know the extent of what he did to her, and then just casually stuck around and washed his hands and was like, I didn't do it. And I mean, there's a callousness there that goes well beyond.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that you covered the Timothy McVeigh execution up in Terre Haute, the federal prison there. How and why did you go up there? That's kind of a national story. I guess it was in our backyard, more or less, with Terre Haute, and I'm assuming that's why we went. But kind of walk us through that day, because that was like a national, possibly international story.
Right.
You're, rubbing elbows or hitting elbows with other journalists to try to get that story. So walk us through that day when Timothy McVeigh was executed in Terre Haute.
Well, the things people don't know is that it was one of the hottest days of the year.
I know that. I remember
it was awful. Like, we were dying, and there was so much media there, and you're there with national media right next to you. The way they do it is there's a lottery system. It sounds really crazy, but they throw all of the media's names in a hat, essentially, and they draw, a number, and whoever is selected, they actually witness the execution. And then it's kind of like a press conference where they speak to what they saw, what they witnessed, so everyone else can report it.
Kind of like a pool feed would be.
A pool
right,
feed,
where everybody gets the same
absolutely.
thing at the
and
same
they
time.
do that sometimes with murder trials.
Yeah.
If they don't want a lot of media in the actual courtroom, or if it's small, they'll have one person that's, the representative, and they have to share their tape with everyone else. Yeah. And
what do you think about cameras in the courtroom?
I think that, obviously I'm a little biased. I think that they should be there. But I think that there are circumstances, when you have a young victim or when you have the victim of a sex crime or something like that, where they shouldn't be. Yeah. I think in the case, like I mentioned earlier, when you're talking about, public indecency, public masturbation, because it's a misdemeanor, it's not considered a sex crime. And so those people have access to the victim's information. It's there for them. And I think that, things like that, when you're dealing with something sexual in nature, those people should be protected in the courtroom and outside of it.
So back to the McVeigh day. So it's hot. You're herded over with all the media. You did not get the lottery to go inside. So now you're waiting. And what's the atmosphere like that out there? I mean, is everybody just kind of eating their lunch and waiting, or writing a story, kind of at least roughing it out, and then you fill the details in later? What do you do?
It was a madhouse, and everyone was sick. So there was some kind of virus that was spreading through the camp.
It was
so
being in Terre Haute, yeah.
yeah, it was bad. So the porta potties were like it was bad. People were throwing up. It was not a pleasant experience. We had to do stories. I remember in particular, we were there and we did stories for sunrise, 6 and 10, and then back again the next day for sunrise. So we literally worked 24 hours straight.
Right.
And we were tired.
Did they spring for a motel for you at least in Terre Haute? There probably weren't any.
They did, but we didn't have time because we had to write and edit the stories. So, it was crazy.
What are you using for video? I mean, you're basically just looking at the outside of the federal penitentiary there south of town, right? I mean, and interviewing, I guess, other journalists.
Kind of focused.
How'd you fill it?
Yeah, I think we did a number of different stories. We focused on, like the last meal. We focused on the media frenzy, the town and how they were dealing with all of these people being in, Terre Haute is a relatively small town to have the nation's media. And there were people from other countries there. So just kind of the chaos of the event. And then you have file footage of what actually, happened with him and that sort of thing.
Yeah. That probably was the highest, at least on a global standpoint, story that you had to cover, with regard to crime and investigation and so forth. I wanted to just kind of close it up with saying, the process is about to come to an end here at the end of the week. Do you think justice was served? Do you think it could have been done better or differently? How would you, clearly you wouldn't have the crime to begin with if you could choose, but because of the circumstances, is this about how you expected it would play out way back when you were reporting this?
It definitely doesn't surprise me. It saddens me because I think that 21 years is far too long for the family to have to go through this. Every time that he has sued or every time that he has appealed or every time that he's sought clemency, all of that, they have to relive it. They have to relive it being talked about. They probably, we know they relive it every day anyway, right? But they have had to wait 21 years, so they've been victimized over and over and over again. I think something needs to change in our system where, I understand the need for appeals, in certain circumstances, but this was a pretty clear-cut case, and there were two different juries that, decided death was the answer, and there was no denying that he did it. And, when you have a situation where someone is caught at the scene with the knife and is admitting that they did it, how many appeals do they really need? So I think that there are certain cases where they need to really take a deep look at why it's taking so long and, understand that this is devastating for the families to have to go through this for so long.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you coming on Inside Look to kind of recount that. It's been 25 years ago almost, and yet you remember it like it happened yesterday. I guess that's how all your stories are. They're right up here and here and don't go anywhere.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking.
Yeah, it really is. And if you'd like to hear more about Stefanie, I kind of blew past your biography and how you got into this. You were on an earlier podcast about a month and a half ago, so you can find that here on Inside Look. Just scroll up to Stefanie's first appearance, and you can hear about your fascinating background and your passion for solving crimes and investigating, advocating for victims and families. And we really appreciate it again, Stefanie. Thanks for taking your time out here this afternoon. I'm Jeff Lyons. You can get Inside Look wherever you get your podcast. You can also watch on the 14 News YouTube channel with Stefanie Silvey. I'm Jeff Lyons. Thanks for joining.